My name is Matthias Gauly. I'm currently the president of Eaap, and it's my pleasure to guide you through the plenary session this morning. This session is videotaped, so if you like, you can listen and look at the talks again a second time. If you go to the Eaap homepage, this is exactly where you'll find these different talks, which is also the case for last year's. So the topic we are dealing with today is Food 2030. What type of animal science and livestock industry will be necessary? This is the question. And if you think about this as an animal scientist, and then a couple of things may pop up to your mind. And the first thing you will think about is the growing population, which we are expecting over the next years, which will be challenged to feed these people. Because what we sometimes try to forget, especially living in Europe, in another part of the States, is there is still a growing demand in many of the countries. And certainly these people will have the right to get something to eat. And if you go a bit further, you will think about the areas where we still have an extra demand of food because the people currently and nowadays are not get a sufficient amount of calories, of energy and nutrients. On the other side, if you look to the comfort zones, which is Europe and the northern part of the States, you have a different situation and you have a different discussion. A discussion going around the use of antibiotics, going around food safety, probably for good reason, going around animal welfare, which is of high importance for us. And this did lead to the development of movements against the type of livestock we are having nowadays. And therefore, the question comes up, where will we be in 2030? Having in mind that there is still a growing population, having in mind that there is still a demand on one side, and certainly there's the issue about animal welfare and about the use of antibiotics. Lucky enough, we found some very interesting people coming over to Dubrovnik to discuss these topics with us from different perspectives. And the first speaker I'd like to introduce is Dan Weary. He's coming from Canada. He's working at the University of British Columbia. And he is working in a group within the animal welfare program. And if you look what they're doing, it's a couple of colleagues working there, very much related to animal welfare, looking for traits, how we can measure in the future the level of animal well-being on farm size. They're working a lot with dairy, but they're also working a lot with many other animals. I want to stimulate you to look at the work they're doing, and I'm pretty sure after the talk of Dan, you will do so. Dan, please come up here. We were looking forward to hear your talk.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And thank you also to Andrea for the kind invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure to be invited here and to have a chance to talk to you. I said I would talk about a changing role for the animal scientist, but because it's the first talk and to make it hopefully a little bit more fun for you, but also maybe a little bit more humiliating for me, I've decided to make this a little bit more personal. About the ways that I would like to at least change as an animal scientist by the time 2030 comes along. And I'll have you note that by the time 2030 comes along, I'll be 67 years old. So it's about time I will have changed, I guess. Okay, so I come from British Columbia. Actually, hearing about Croatia made me think a lot about British Columbia. We also have about 4 million people. We're on the coast. We have mountains. So here I am up in one of our mountains, and I'm looking at this fantastic view that we have. This is the top of Whistler Mountain. And I think sometimes I'm very good at looking out of the view, but not really thinking about my own very limited worldview. And so this is sort of the first of 3 important faults I think that I have as an animal scientist that I'm going to try to work on. And maybe some of you will see some of this in yourself, but at least you'll see it in me. In this case, the limited view, at least when it comes to animal welfare, is I don't really have much of an excuse for, because in many ways I've been thinking about the nature of animal welfare for a very long time. So this is a framework for understanding animal welfare that I developed with my colleagues David Fraser, Barry Milligan, and Ed Pager more than 20 years ago. And you'll see that there's 3 different components here. This emphasis on biological functioning. Is the animal doing well? Is it healthy, for example? This emphasis on affective states. That's the emotional states of the animals. So for example, is the animal experiencing pain or discomfort? And then there's also this idea of, is the animal living a reasonably natural life? Now, we acknowledge this as the framework that we use, and I think this is now quite widely adopted and acknowledged, the framework we use for understanding animal welfare. But in fact, if you look at the type of research that's done, including the kind of research that I've done, it's often much more limited. In many academics, you'll see we'll focus especially in this area, academics working, more basic academics working in animal welfare. And most of the work that you'll see at production-oriented meetings relating to animal welfare will often focus on these kinds of features. In fact, if you look at the literature related to animal production sciences in relation to animal welfare, you'll see this bias. My colleague Marina von Kaiserlink and I had the pleasure of doing a review for the Journal of Dairy Science. Last year, the journal celebrated its 100th edition, and so they did a special issue looking at reviews in certain areas. Now, animal welfare, you could say, is an easy one, because really the very first paper we could find was 1983, and only in the 90s, and really only in this century, did we see a large number of papers coming available. But despite the very recency of this research, almost all of it is production related, or this related to this sort of biological functioning aspect. So here's what we call a wordle. So what we did is we went through and looked at the keywords that appeared in the abstracts and titles of the papers we found, and you'll see from here the larger words are the ones which appear more prominently. Things like lameness, health, prevalence, disease, lesions, hock, mastitis, these kinds of things, which I think we would all agree are important animal welfare concerns, but if you think for a minute, are also concerns that are really related at this biological functioning type sphere. So a limited worldview, I think, also in this literature at least, and we can blame this maybe on the American dairy scientists, and hopefully among the European animal scientists there's a broader view. Luckily, and I share this, I think, with many of the people who are fortunate enough to work as academics, is we have young students that come into our group and they challenge our worldview. Often this is very uncomfortable. Here is Frances Flower. This is now going back again almost 20 years ago. And Frances Flower came to me with this idea of saying that she wanted to work on cow-calf separation. 20 years ago, a student coming to ask you to work on cow-calf separation. This was, I didn't know how to handle this. This was something that not only did we not do in the industry, it was something we didn't even talk about, something that we felt was going to be detrimental to production, and something that's likely to be detrimental to cow and calf health as well. And somehow or other, Frances convinced me to do some projects in this, and she came over and started to work in the area and did some very nice work actually looking at the effects of delayed separation on the distress response of cow and calves. And I think, again, this somehow reflects my limited worldview, that I encouraged Frances to work on this distress response, essentially the negative welfare impacts, potentially, of keeping animals longer together. And this, I think, also acted as a bit of a barrier for me in terms of continuing to work in this area for very many years, although I'll return to this issue a little bit later in the talk. Here's a picture of me some years ago. You'll notice my hair is a little darker. And this is me with some of my members of my family. I come from a family of 4. I'm almost the youngest. And that means that I had to learn to talk very loudly. And maybe some of you will notice I had to learn to speak very quickly. So I became very good at those skills, but I'm rather less good as a listener. And so this is the second fault I wanted to tell you a little bit about, which is that I think sometimes that I have rather poor communication skills for somebody who should be in the business of communication. And I think especially it comes to poor communication skills when it comes to the perspective of really listening and trying to understand what other people are telling me. And I think that sometimes I share this feature with other aspects of our industry. And I'm going to give you a couple different examples. And one of which is that sometimes, and I think this is maybe more so in North America, that we respond to criticism in agriculture, people working within it, including animal scientists, respond to criticism by putting up barriers. So, for example, we feel it's partly our responsibility to protect the industry from criticism. And part of that protection can sometimes be about putting up walls. And this might be a concern if we think that the amount of openness that an organization has or is perceived to have is associated with the amount of trust that's put in that organization. And there's some literature associated with this in the corporate literature. And we had this very good student, Jesse Robbins, who wanted to test this idea also if the same thing could happen in the animal production area, because this is an important issue that we have. And one of the movements that we see happening in North America and some other parts of the world is the idea of what's called these ag-gag laws, which is the idea that taking photographs or videos, especially those, of course, that might be embarrassing for industry somehow, should be prevented. Partly people feel that these videos are often unfair and that they can be very harmful for the industry, and that's part of the rationale for it. But if you think about what I just told you, then the idea that we're preventing people from seeing things too might actually end up undermining and might actually end up chipping away at the trust we have at the institution. So there's the hypothesis then that awareness of these so-called ag-gag laws, by the way, this is not a word we used in our research at all because it's pejorative, but this idea that these laws which prevent taking photographs, video, or audio will actually reduce the credibility of the farmers and the industry. So this is an example of the kind of sort of experimental social science that we've done some work on. In this case, we have a panel of 700 participants, and we are asking them a set of structured, validated questions, which are designed to get at this trust issue. So it's actually 12 responses to 12 questions put together. Here I'm showing you the average response here on this scale, and the absolute top, or these are the people that are as trusting as they can be, the most trusting. They answered the top to all the questions related to trust about agriculture, and these are the people that are as distrusting as possible. And so what we did is we randomly assigned, we had 700 participants, and we randomly assigned them either to read a scenario which told them about this intention to have a new law which was going to prevent people from taking these kinds of audio and video recordings. And we had the other sample, the control group, read exactly the same length of text, exactly the same amount of complexity, but in this case, they read about a variety of hay. Okay, so nothing to do with the issue of ag-gag laws. So they both read some information, and then we just asked them questions about how trusting they are on farmers. And what you can see here overall, first thing I want you to notice is that there's a lot of variability here. So you have some people that are essentially as trusting as you can imagine, and some people that are very skeptical about agricultural production. And on average, and this is the good news for us in agriculture, people are slightly more positive than neutral. Okay? This is our individuals who read about the variety of hay. But if you just have them read this one paragraph talking about the possibility of this law, then we reduce here by almost a full point in our Likert scale. So that's a pretty big difference as these things go, certainly highly significant. Now, what I want you to notice is that in this case, these participants we ask a wide range, of course, of demographic variables, and these participants are omnivores. We can look across a variety of other demographics. The results always the same. So, for example, here are the results for vegetarians, and again, we get a substantial decline when they read about the law. What I also want you to notice is just reading about the law makes people's trust in agriculture about the same as if they, for an omnivore as it is if they were a vegetarian. Okay. Also, just to show how this can affect what people think about the actual treatment that's happening on those farms, here we asked people if they felt that the farm animals have a good life. And again, we have our control condition. In this case, the news is not so good. Only about 40%, these are American participants, only about 40% of participants felt that the farm animals were having a good life. And just reading the paragraph about ag-lag laws reduces that down to 20%. Okay, so there's our first approach, shall we say, at communication. In this case, it's really a lack of communication, this idea of secrecy or hiding things, and this is obviously not a good thing when it comes to the trust that people can have in our industry. So if that doesn't work, well then what about this idea of going out there and just telling people what we do? And I think this is, again, a common idea that we have in agriculture, is that when we get these criticisms about what we do, it's because people don't understand. They don't understand either what we're doing, they're ignorant of agricultural practices, or they don't understand why we're doing it. So in other words, if we did a better job of getting our message out, then we would get better acceptance. And so we do a lot of this in general, I would say, in Canada, and even at our farm. So this is our own research farm, this UBC dairy farm, and here's one of the open houses that we have. We have thousands of visitors come every year. And so it's basically just open the doors and let people come, and we can show off all the good things we're doing. But this also provides an opportunity then to test the hypothesis that if people could see what we do, then they would be less critical of what we do. And we had this very good colleague, Beth Ventura, that actually came and tried to create a structured study around this question. And what Beth did is she took the most naive group of public that she could find that come to our farm. And that is, every year we have a bunch of different tours. We have many farmer tours, but there's this one group which is the slow food tour. And they come actually mostly from Vancouver. They come on their bicycles, and they come and look at various different types of agricultural production. Many of them have never been on a farm before. In fact, the participants that we're interviewing here really had no experience with dairy farms at all. And what Beth did is she asked them a series of questions before they went on the tour, and then they went on this very nice tour of our farm, our farm workers showing them what we thought are the good things about our very conventional production system that we have at our research farm. And then afterwards, Beth Ventura asked them the same questions again. Okay, so here, I don't have time to give you very much, but just a few examples of quotes. These are what the participants said when Beth interviewed them. And so here's a quote from before they went on the tour, and here's one participant, and this is quite typical. It says, well, I'm quite concerned about the treatment of the animals. I'm afraid they're going to be in cramped living conditions. But afterwards, they often came back with this perspective that the animals seem to be well cared for. They felt that the quality of care was better than what they expected. And the practices, in this case, they say, seem to be quite ethical. The problem is that we also often got the reverse scenario. So here is another very common response. People come on the farm, and they'd come out for a bicycle ride. And we asked them what they thought about conditions on a dairy farm, and they never thought about conditions on a dairy farm. So they really didn't have any concerns because they haven't thought about it. Afterwards, they had lots of thoughts. So here's one participant, and they said, I would prefer to see the animals grazing in the field, eating grass, and calves not separated so quickly from their mothers. So just a typical kind of response. But let's go back to our hypothesis. Does this access to visiting a farm, learning about farm procedures, make people less critical? So here are our responses before the people visited the farm, and you can see there's more or less equal among the three quadrants. So the majority, though, are confident that the conditions, the animals are having a good life. There's a few that are neutral and a few that are not confident. After the tour, the really main change is that more are neutral and fewer are confident. So in fact, having access to this, what we think, this farm that we're very proud of, that we think is one of the nicest farms in the region, actually is having the opposite effect than what we predicted. Okay, we can actually go one step further beyond this idea of thinking where we started off as just sort of showing people what we have, and then we asked people what they thought about what we have. And now, in this case, we're actually going a step further and asking them what it is that they want in a dairy farm. So this is some nice work by Clarissa Cardosa. And Clarissa asks people to tell us what they imagined what was an ideal dairy farm and to describe that. And in this case, Clarissa is using qualitative analysis. So she's doing the analysis of the text responses. And she has a sample size of 700 participants. This sort of pictogram shows, in a sense, reflection of some of the main themes that come up. So again, the people expected the animals were well cared for. They expected the animals to be healthy, but they're also expecting the animals to be outside, to be on grass, and they're expecting the cows to be in contact with their mums. One thing I want you to bring you back to now is then, as I said at the earlier in my talk, is this conception of animal welfare, where now you see people bringing up issues absolutely about biological functioning, this idea that the animals are able to express certain basic pleasures and avoid pains, but also this very strong importance in terms of the animals being able to express some reasonably natural behaviors. One of the things that will strike you, and certainly has been an ongoing issue in the debate in animal welfare, is that sometimes practices that might be good for one kind of component might actually be bad for another. In other words, there may be challenges between, or trade-offs, stress between these different components of welfare. And I want to give you another example from Clarissa's work, Clarissa Cardosa's work, showing how people believe that we should be resolving these issues when these different components are stress tests against one another. And I'll give you an example of what this looks like. So again, Clarissa went to a panel of about, in this case, 600 participants, and she again did an experiment. In this case, it's a 2x2 experiment. But the 2x2 features are designed to elicit different types of animal welfare concerns. So this will be familiar to many of you that work on dairy cattle. You can have our cows outside on grass. We can have our cows inside. So this is one factor, indoor or out. As many of you will know, walking around the hot sun in Croatia, is that there is a risk of being outside, and that is that you can overheat. And if you weigh 800 kilograms and you produce 50 kilograms of milk a day, then there's even more chance of overheating. And so a big welfare issue actually for dairy cows is this heat stress. One of the ways in which we can protect cows from heat stress is actually just provide shade in pasture, but we can also provide a lot of heat mitigation opportunities indoor our barns. So this was our second factor. First was outside or inside, and the second was they had protection from heat stress or did not have protection. And here are the results. So this is a study that's still just in review, so it's brand new data. And what you can see, first of all, maybe is most obvious. In this case, we have, again, our Likert average. This is a compilation of responses to 3 different questions, all designed to get at the attitude to this way of keeping the animals, where 5 is the absolute best and 1 is the absolute worst. And you can see people are pretty positive about these cows on pasture with shade. You can also, and this is not surprising, people are least positive about cows inside with no heat mitigation. But I think what's maybe more surprising, at least to me, was this aspect here, which is that people rated the indoor facility with fans as actually significantly better than pasture without shade. And it gets us to realize, I think, a little bit about the sophistication with which people think and trade off these different animal welfare issues. But it also, I think, suggests that we need to sometimes try harder than just accept these as trade-offs, but rather look for intelligent solutions which allows us to have the best of both worlds. And one of the things which we saw in the qualitative responses to this study is that people would often, for example, in this scenario, say, oh, yeah, this sounds good, but why do the cows also not have access to the outdoors? And so this idea that people were actually looking for sort of an ideal hybrid, something which provided the animals the protection that I think we all seek and that is maybe a common feature for us as animal scientists in terms of wanting to provide the animals a protection from the stresses and the difficulties of the natural environment, while at the same time providing the animals access to a reasonably natural life. And we've done, or we're doing, starting to try to do some work in this area. So this is an example. And this doesn't look anything like the picture of the people drew, but I think it illustrates some different themes. So here we have, this is our farm back in British Columbia, the mountains behind it. And in this case, the door is open. So the cows go in and out of the barn whenever they want. The barn has access to, of course, excellent food, also actually excellent heat mitigation. In this case, the cows are not on grass. It's in the winter, and it's very damaging for the cows to go on grass in the winter. So we're using an outdoor pack, but the animals can come in and out when they want. So maybe not ideal, but it's a chance to try to chip away at some of these issues and see if we can provide hybrids that meet the concerns while still work well for our farmers. This brings us back a circle. So I started off by saying that we need to be more open. Certainly we don't want to be closing the doors to our barns, figuratively, or literally in terms of some of these laws that we've talked about. And there's a number of ways which we can actively try to engage with the broader public about the practices we do. Part of that is just showing them what we do. A second part is asking them about what they think about what we do. And then the third part I showed you is actually asking them what they think we should do. What do they consider as ideal? And this requires more than just asking people, but I think it also requires thinking seriously about what they're saying, and then ultimately trying to come up with solutions to what they're saying. And that's why I showed you that picture of that hybrid solution, is trying to chip away at this issue. Ultimately, I think what we then need to be going back to people to see how these various solutions or our approaches that we're trying resonate with the public expectations for how we should be performing as an industry. Okay, that's my second fault, secrecy. What about my third fault? Well, this picture I threw in especially for Matthias, me and my very elegant Lederhausen. This is me here, I think this photo shows a couple different things, but most importantly, I think it shows that I was really rather naive, and I think I'm still naive in many ways. One of which is I agreed to put on Lederhausen when my parents gave them to me. This shows me being naive in one way. And my brother obviously has just told me to stick my finger up my nose, so this is also another type of naivety. So the question then is, how do I do a better job of keeping my finger out of my nose? How do I do a better job of being less naive as we move forward? Okay, so I think naive means at least a couple different things. But for me, especially, it's that I believe what I'm told, and that I accept the limitations that I'm provided. And I want to struggle against both these faults, as I'll explain to you in a minute. One example of how sometimes I at least have believed what I've told is I have, of course, as a working in dairy science and in animal production, I've worked closely with many veterinary colleagues, and I have often just accepted what they've told me. And one of the things that I've been told repeatedly, and one reason why I've been discouraged from doing more work in this issue of cow-calf separation, is that cow-calf separation is really required because it improves the health of calves and cows. And that's told from a number of different perspectives, that claim, and most notably, I would say, in relation to Johne's disease. And so, in fact, there are, around the world, there are Johne's campaigns try to prevent this very important disease, and one of the main features of many of these campaigns is the idea that cows and calves need to be separated early so we can prevent transmission of Johne's. Luckily, we've been able to recruit this very wonderful postdoc, Annabelle Beaver, recently from Cornell. And Annabelle, before she started her main project, had some time to do a little bit of work in the office. And we started talking about this issue. And Annabelle said, well, why don't I try to do a systematic review on the evidence to really try to understand the quantity of the evidence, and the quality of the evidence. And these systematic reviews are really a wonderful tool that we now have as agricultural scientists, which give us a very structured way of evaluating quality. And I really think that there's great hope and potential for seeing this much more now as our standard of evidence. Before we give advice, that we really look for high quality evidence, and a systematic review is one way which we can really look at the quality of that evidence. This gives an example of what Annabelle did. She starts with a general search. You identify a large number of papers. You read these papers. a lot of them, of course, don't qualify because they themselves may be reviews, or they may be math models with no data, or they may be talking about beef cattle, not dairy cattle, et cetera, et cetera. So you get down a bit, but you also find new papers, because you see papers that are cited in the reference sections. And at the end of the day, here's the sample that Annabelle was able to find in terms of any kind of data associated with disease. There's more on calves than there is on cows, so she could only find enough data to talk about for mastitis when it came to cows, but for calves, she could find data on non-specific scours, on cryptosporidium, on yonis, on immunity, and mortality. Okay, but what does this data look like? What is the evidence that early separation is resulting in higher levels of health for the calves and cows? So here I'm looking at a table that Annabelle produced. I'm very pleased to have Philippe in my audience right now, because this is the paper that's just been submitted as an invited review for JDS, so I'm hoping he's smiling. And so here what we have is the effects, looking at the effects of a prolonged suckling period on the cow and calf health. And so first I want you to look at this negative column. So what is the evidence that a prolonged suckling period has negative effects on either calf or cow health? And when you go through that column, you'll see that there is very little evidence to justify a claim that keeping cows and calves together is negative for either cow or calf health. Okay, that's result number one. Result number two is actually, we do see some evidence for the opposite, surprisingly enough. So here for mastitis, and for those people that have been aware of this literature for a little while, it won't be that surprising, but indeed, there was a lovely presentation yesterday looking at the attitudes of French farmers that are using suckling systems. And one of the things that these French farmers felt that was an advantage of using it was that they had better health for their mastitis health, less mastitis in their herds. And indeed, the review of the scientific literature suggests that the effects on udder health are often positive of a prolonged suckling period. We also see evidence of a positive effect for these non-specific scours, and everything else is sort of a mess. So most of it's neutral or mixed, and we can talk about why that is later if you're interested. But I especially draw your attention to this Yonis result, which we see repeated over and over again, the claim that we need to be taking calves and cows away on the basis of Yonis. And when we look at a systematic review of the literature, we see no evidence to justify that recommendation. Okay, so second aspect of naive is that I think are too often willing to accept the limitations of a given. And I started off with that story talking about Frances Flower, this woman from England writing to me saying she wants to come and work on cow-calf separation. And the project that I had her start working on was this effect of distress associated with separation, this negative thing of prolonged keeping the cows and calves. And of course, we saw more distress at separation the longer we kept cows and calves together. And that was another reason I sort of abandoned the research area. Luckily, I had the good fortune of meeting Julie Johnson, and Julie Johnson came and did this wonderful project with us at the University of British Columbia, looking at various ways of keeping cows and calves together. And Julie had the great idea, building on 20 years of research in weaning in cattle as well as in pigs, that the one thing you need to do to wean animals well is don't combine stressors, right? So if you think about it, when we separate the cow and calf, late separation, the calf is fully dependent upon the mother as a source of milk, but also fully dependent upon the mother as psychologically, as a form of social attachment. And so how could we then develop suckling systems where we separate those two different aspects? And what Julie did, is nothing very complicated. So here is a layout of our barn. This is our cow-calf barn. The cows are just in here. Here are the calves in a creep area. The calves can come back and forth and spend time with the cows when they want. But what the calves also had access to is one of these robotic milk feeders. So the calves could go drink from mom, but they could also go drink from the milk feeder. So they had access to a second source of milk. I want you to notice in terms of today's theme, we talked about having sort of conventional or traditional. In this case, this is neither. These are animals which are reared in a sort of a conventional way, but they're allowed to perform these natural behaviors, and we're adding a bit of technology which allows those behaviors, I think, to work better. Let me show you what the effects of this are on the cows. So in a sense, this creates a sort of a natural experiment, because some of the animals were using this automatic feeder, drinking lots of milk, and other of the calves weren't interested so much in the automatic feeder and hardly used it at all. So this is looking right at the time after the mother had been taken away, and you can see that those calves that were using the automatic milk feeder continued to gain weight at a very good level. For a dairy calf in this period around separation to be gaining weight at this rate is very good, while those animals that were not using the automatic milk feeder showed much poorer weight gains. So that's one measure of a production-related measure. But as I said earlier, we want to think more broadly, not just use production-related measure. So what about a measure of the animal's affective response, emotional response? Let's look at vocalizations. So here's another one of Julie's results. Here are calves that were using the automatic milk feeder, vocalizing. Here's the median response right at 0 versus the animals that were not using the automatic milk feeder, vocalizing at much higher rates. Okay, so a bunch of different evidence, a bunch of different faults on my side. I said I would end by talking about what I hope to be in 2030, and I hope that at least some of these themes will also resonate with what you think might be a vision for us to go forward as scientists, as animal scientists in the years to come. One is that I think we need to work much harder to actually strive to understand the perspectives of others. So not just admire the view, but actually be trying to understand the variety of worldviews around us. Second, I think we need to be working much harder to be open about what we do, about why we do it, and about what I'm now going to try to do differently to address the concerns that I now understand, because I've been striving to understand your worldview as well. And finally, I think I need to take my finger out of my nose. I need to be a little bit less naive. And one of the ways in which I'm really going to try to work very hard by doing that is really demanding a very high standard of evidence. And I said earlier, I think these comprehensive lit reviews provide one way of looking at the quality of evidence as well, very well. And before I give professional advice, I'm going to demand that kind of evidence. And I'm also going to work harder to seek solutions to problems rather than just accept the limitations. And on that note, I'd like to thank very much the sponsors for my work. None of this could we do without this generous support by the people on this slide. And I also would like to thank, of course, my close colleague, Nina von Kaiserlink. We're doing something very anti-animal welfare here, eating these crustaceans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this very stimulating talk. We'll invite you again in 2030. See you in Lederhosen, and this is a promise. We have time for 1 or 2 questions, and then at the end of the session, we will have another half an hour for questions. Is there one? There is one. I'm not sure if you have a mic. Do we have a microphone for Mike? Microphone for Mike. Yeah.
Thanks very much. A great talk. I'd like to be like you as well, so maybe we could form a club of changed people. So I'll ask this question in a provocative way in order to solicit a response, which is, you talked about consumers coming to the farm and looking and so on. I'd venture to suggest that those people are not normal. Every single person in this room is incredibly privileged when it comes to access to food. So I wonder, how do we square the ethical circle whereby every imposition of standards that we put onto animal production, we condemn millions more people to food poverty?
Good, excellent question. Thank you very much. So I just answer that in 2 ways. First is sort of a mea culpa. Absolutely, all the samples I'm talking about, these are sort of there's a sort of a nasty acronym out there called WEIRD, which is, I won't explain to you what it is, but essentially biased in the sense that it's Western, rich countries, etc. And this is very much of that ilk. And so I think the kinds of concerns I've been talking to you and how we respond to them are about my own local situation and about the majority of the dairy producers and the dairy industry that I'm interacting with, which is in the sort of the rich Western world, shall we say. So I agree with the criticism. I guess what I would also say, though, is I think we also need to be critical, too, about the premise behind the second part of the question, which is that producing foods in the kinds of ways which I'm talking about actually does result in increased level of food insecurity, at least in other parts of the world. And I'm not sure that there's good evidence to support that. I guess coming back to the idea of really looking for a high standard of evidence. I think I do feel that it's not just me when it comes to this problem in agriculture where we sort of learn a mantra and we keep on saying it, is that we really need to be looking much more critically at the assumptions behind the kinds of truisms that we say out, including these ones that keeping cows and calves results in yonis. I think it's the same kinds of thing by saying providing higher welfare conditions for our cows is going to somehow or other result in higher levels of insecurity elsewhere in the world. I'm not sure that the data bears that out.
Maybe I can just disagree in the sense it seems logical because trade, but developing countries have to trade their way out of poverty.
I think it worked.
It is there, yeah. So it was on trade, really, that I was referring to.
Yeah, and I mean, this opens up, obviously, a much broader discussion for which I have very little expertise. I don't mind speculating on it, but I would say that I'm not sure that the solution to food insecurity in developing countries is exporting our foodstuffs from developed countries. I mean, obviously it can be in an emergency kind of situation, but I don't see that as a long-term solution to food insecurity.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much, Mike. If you keep your question in mind, we can come back to that later, if this is okay for you, because we'll have to move on. Dan, thanks again. Thank you very much.